Kia ora whanau, welcome back. Graham Smith from ALEC here again. So here we're looking at section 5 on delivering embedded literacy and numeracy outcomes. So this presentation takes you through what you need to know about delivering embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcomes in terms of your assessment against the NCALNE VOC and Unit Standard 21204. So make sure you've got your study guide or assessment guide if you need further information. Okay, heads up, here we are again. We've tracked through the New Zealand context, the connections into Māori literacy and numeracy. We've mapped the training demands of our course in terms of the literacy and numeracy requirements. We've used some appropriate diagnostic tools to figure out where our learners are at. Now we know the difference between what they ought to be able to do versus what they can actually do. And that brings us to section 5 on embedding. Right, what do you need to do for your task 5? Let's get on to that. There's a couple of things here. You need to know how to write embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcomes. And when you do this, when you create your embedded learning outcomes, it helps you frame the kind of learning that you want to do. And it also helps you identify the teaching strategies and the activities that you want to build into your training interventions. So let's have a look. Writing embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcomes. It forces you to bring together a couple of things. And we have a system, a process, which is simple and it's easy to follow and helps to make this happen basically. So writing embedded outcomes, the way we do it, forces you to bring together the identified literacy and numeracy skills that your learners need together with the specific vocational training content. That's your work content, your course content. Let's have a look at some examples. Okay, over the page. Here we are. Okay, this is an example of an embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcome. And just look at the first 3 lines there. The rest is just detail, but understand and produce a range of specialized words in the context of basic tool identification by doing certain things. So those first 3 lines, that's really our learning outcome, and those bullet points are the kinds of activities that we might start using to actually do that. There's a formula here that we use, and you can see it on the left hand side of the screen. It's basically we choose some action verbs that are going to help us frame the kind of learning that we want to do. Then we insert the identified literacy or numeracy skill that we want to focus on, and then we talk about that in the context of the vocational or trades training content area. So here I've chosen tool identification. It might be for a carpentry course or something like that, but it could be for hairdressing, beauty therapy, engineering, whatever you like, whatever your particular context is. And then I've got a sequence of activities, and the kind of flow I've got here is discussing it, learning how to do it, and then a couple of practice activities describing the physical qualities of the tools and then completing a worksheet. So that's how I've thought about my activities that go together with the learning outcome. Here's another example. This one had to do with 12 and 24-hour time, and it was created by some of our learners who work on the roads, and they needed their guys to be able to fill out their logbooks and timesheets and other paperwork that they were working with correctly. So this one here, read, understand and record 12 and 24-hour time in the context of vehicle logbook entries by doing these things here. Discussing how they're important. They had some dominoes with different time faces on them, and that was one of their practice activities, and then they actually practiced doing it on some dummy versions of the reporting forms that they had to use. Right, so here's how it works. Just a reminder, learning outcomes is shortened from intended learning outcomes. So when we talk about learning outcomes, these are our intended learning outcomes. This is about starting with the end in mind. This is where we want to go. So learning outcomes is not the same as output. It's not the same as what the actual outcome might be. You might get this outcome or you might not, but this is the intention. This is your intention. In terms of action verbs to describe and frame the learning, we take our action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. If you haven't heard of that, don't worry about it. It's just a fancy name for a big long list of words that Mr. Bloom came up with. What we've done at ALEC is we've put this into a potama, which is a Māori framework, and you can see it looks like a staircase, and as you go up the staircase, the kind of learning that goes on gets more demanding, basically. So at the lower levels of the stairs here, the first 3 steps around remembering things, understanding things, and applying things, most of our tutors that we work with, that's what they want their learners to do. Remember information, understand it, and apply it. So we draw our action verbs from the lists that relate to those 3. And if you're doing this course, it's a bit small to see on the screen here, but there's a handout that goes with this as well. So just a selection of different words, different verbs that you can use that relate to each of these different areas. So that's Bloom's taxonomy, and this is the ALEC Potama version. As I said before, the focus here is what the learners are expected to be able to do at the end of the learning, and that time frame is up to you to decide. Short time frames are good. Might be a chunk of learning that you do over an hour or over an afternoon. Once you start talking about longer time frames, you start getting into course outcomes, which are probably too big for our purposes here. So back to our formula, back to our format for how we write these embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcomes. Here's our formula in orange on the left hand side here. Action verbs that describe and frame the learning. The identified literacy and numeracy skills from your mapping and diagnostic, and then we add the words in the context of. Your vocational training or trades training content, and then we say how you're going to do it. And the sequence here that we like to use at the moment: learning why, learning how, practicing, and using in context. And this is a very similar framework to very similar sequence to what you'll find in the support resources that accompany the learning progressions. So have a go, follow the format, see if you can create your own learning outcomes along these lines. Just another example for you. What have we got here? Again, technical terms. I'll read it out. Identify and explain technical terms in the context of workplace health and safety by discussing, learning, practicing, using. Quite a nice little sequence there. And there's the formula along the side. So the templates that we use for the assessment task, I mean, we have a template for every assessment task, and the template for task 5 helps you work through these different areas, work through these different parts of the formula that we're promoting here for creating embedded learning outcomes. Another example, this one's to do with numeracy again. Understand and use the relationship between decimal place value and fractions in the context of weighing in a catering course by discussing its purpose, linking fractions to decimals, describing hundredths as tenths and hundredths, and thousands as tenths and hundredths and thousandths, and then practicing and ordering, placing decimals on the place value chart. And if you haven't seen a place value chart, we've got a really great one which there's a free download on the website as well. So you might want to pause there and just have a good look at that one. There's a lot to take in. When you come to actually delivering your training, these literacy and numeracy training interventions, think about the kind of strategies that you're actually using when you're teaching. And in terms of how the TEC thinks about instructional strategies or teaching strategies, they think of these 6 different areas. How are you giving feedback, or what feedback are you giving? What are you discussing, and what kind of discussions are you having? What are you explaining? How are you modeling? How are you prompting your students? What questions are you asking? So these are what we call teaching strategies. Good tutors and teachers and trainers use these strategies all the time. We have a series of activities that we like people to do. There's handouts that go with these that you can download off the website. The first one has a set of case studies. So you read the case studies to get an idea of the demands, the literacy and numeracy training demands. follow the format that we're talking about here, aim for contextualization, and see if you can write a set of literacy and numeracy learning outcomes for those scenarios. So that's one practice activity that we'd like you to have a go at. If you do it with a colleague or a group of colleagues, you'll get a better result as well. The second practice activity, and this one relates more directly to what you need to do for your task 5, is develop a set of embedded literacy and numeracy learning outcomes for 1 or 2 specific aspects of your trade. Pick something for literacy and something else for numeracy, and the more specific or the narrower that you can make this, the better your result. And this is something, if you do this well, whatever you create here, you can use that in your task 5 assessment for our qualification assessment purposes. Activity 3, we suggest that you use assessment tool results for 3 or a group of learners. Analyze the results, look for trends and patterns, complete a learning plan for the group or complete individual learning plans for each person, and then have a go at lining up the learning plans with some embedded literacy and numeracy outcomes and appropriate contextualized activities. So that's just kind of tweaking it to a higher level again, trying to target those embedded literacy learning outcomes for specific learners who are in your training and you've identified what their needs are. You want to take it another step further, you could design mini literacy and numeracy pre and post assessment tasks to go on either side of these outcomes to measure before and after what it is that you actually want to teach. Where can you get your activities from, your literacy and numeracy activities? Use the learning progression resources. Those are that big pile of books that you'll have in your study guide. They're also online. You can use those as a starting point. You can adapt them, you can modify them, or you can also come up with your own activities, develop your own activities. So there's a lot to get your head around for task 5. Make sure you get a grip on what the format is for the embedded learning outcomes. Make sure you have the template so you can work through the different sections there. And any questions, give us a call, send us an email, let us know how we can help you if you need it. Kia ora, cheers, thanks for listening. Kia ora whānau.